Oxford, but she's about a quarter of the size.
Hmm.
Hello, Jesse. This is Carlos Austin. Hello, Jesse. This is Carlos Austin. Good to see you again.
Oh, hey, Carlos. How's it going?
Dude, man, it's been a while.
Yeah, really. How you been?
Good, good. Everything's good. I'm still alive. Rodney, welcome to the show. Look forward to hearing
Ooh,
your
what's back
thoughts.
here?
I don't know if he can hear you.
It's all right. It's good to look forward to hearing from you. Are you coming back for more of this, or are you just doing this show?
Right now, this is just a special show, but definitely more sometime soon.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna record it so that if you need it, let me know. You can ping
Oh,
me.
thanks, Carlos. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you can ping me on Twitter if you like. Good deal. Well, have a wonderful show.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Ay, caramba.
Hey there. So Ismodian showed up. So they're
Oh,
in this
good.
room. Yeah, and I gave them the privileges to come on stage. So whenever you guys want to, they can just jump on stage.
That sounds perfect.
Cool.
Yeah. I naturally retreated to backstage, but
I like it.
yeah, then you can actually there can be an intro, right, and add a little
Yeah.
drama.
Yeah, exactly. So we usually hold for 10-ish minutes or whatever, and then we'll start getting the show on the road
Sounds cool.
once it feels full. Cool. Guys, welcome in. Thanks for coming. We're gonna get the show on the road pretty quickly here. Just waiting for the rooms to fill up.
Giving it about 90 more seconds to make sure that everybody who's navigating their way in here, maybe people who are coming for the first time, are able to get here before we start. But super excited to see everybody's smiling avatar faces. This is actually the first episode of this show that I've done since the avatars got much spiffier. So it's pretty wild to be in here now and see like how far it's come even in just 1 year's time. Much less than when we were doing this a couple years back.
Hey, we might want to have you mute while you're waiting back here, just since it's projecting. Cool. Thank you. Ooh.
All right, we're going to go ahead and kick things off. So before we dive right in, can everybody give me a virtual smiley face of your choosing to make sure you can hear me all right, feeling good, everything's where it should be. If you don't know how to do that, there's an emoji button to the top right of the menu. Just click that, and it'll bring up your different options. Yeah, that's what I like to see. Awesome. Well, welcome. Welcome to Tech Talk. I'm excited to be back. This is a virtual talk show with the leaders in tech in terms of thinking and developers and artists and all range of subject matter experts and people that it's great to learn from. And today we have a super, super amazing guest named Rodney Ascher, who is the director of Room 237 and most recently Glitch in the Matrix, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but we're going to dive into more and tread lightly around any potential spoilers. This episode is brought to you thanks to NIGHTSTREAM Festival. NIGHTSTREAM was created by 4 of the top genre film festivals around the country, who in 2020 came together to produce a collaborative online film fest to raise money for filmmakers and charitable organizations alike. This year's fest kicked off yesterday and runs through October 13th, so be sure to check out the full lineup of horror film premieres and events at nightstream.org. And with that, please join me in a massive round of emoji applause for Rodney. All right. Rodney, we're here you are.
Hey
Thanks
guys,
for being
thanks.
here.
Hey Jesse, yeah, this is pretty good. This is pretty great.
Yeah, isn't it? It's always like the best thing seeing the like emoji applause visibly kind of streaming off of everybody's heads.
Yeah, well, you know, every once in a while you see an innovation in this world that you'd want to bring back with you.
Totally. I mean that's exactly where I wanted to dive in. Is like before we like get into the sort of craft, is how does it feel having come off of making this film, A Glitch in the Matrix, which is sort of exploring this question of if we live in a simulation, and now being in a simulation talking about that film?
Well, you know, it's funny because it seems to be sort of something that happens to me again and again and again with these projects, right? Like after I did Room 237, one of the places I screened it, coincidentally, they're part of the NIGHTSTREAM Festival, the Overlook Film Festival. They were called the Stanley Fest, I think, in the first year. That happened at the Stanley Hotel, which is the hotel that Stephen King stayed in that inspired Shining. So I found myself in a van with Leon Vitali, who is Stanley Kubrick's right-hand man and the voice of the guy in the red cloak and Eyes Wide Shut, as well as Mick Garris, who worked closely with Stephen King and directed the TV version, on a tiny one-lane winding mountain road on the way to the Overlook Hotel, because I had been thinking so actively about The Shining for so many years. And then here it is happening again, that I spent too much time thinking about virtual digital worlds, and now I'm stuck in one. And not just, you know, this, which is getting closer and closer to the simulation, right? But the movie itself was, all the interviews were recorded, via, Skype, via, video windows. And it seemed like an interesting way to talk about, digital communications and digital worlds at the time. But little did I know that by the time before we were able to finish the film, 2020, that would be the entire way that I would be interacting with everybody I knew in the world through those little windows. So there's a aspect of these projects in a way that feels like, you think too much about a subject and then you will get sucked into it. I mean, even in the nightmare, in the making of the nightmare, I found myself experiencing sleep paralysis for the first time, in about 10 years. So it's a trap.
Yeah, it's almost like this director's form of method. It's like method directing.
Yeah, at a certain point you become the subject, right? It sucks you in and takes over your life. It's pretty crazy that way.
Well, I want to rewind on something you said just a second ago about here, and actually, let's come out over here if you don't mind. We'll get a little bit further out so everybody can see us. You referenced conducting these interviews over virtual tools, Skype, Zoom, etc. Did you find that was that led to different, a different experience of that interview process, a different experience with the subjects? Were you surprised in any way by that?
I don't know. I mean, I've done it a few different ways, right? That, in 237, it was all phone interviews, though I guess there was Skype voice only. I mailed people digital recorders to record themselves as they talked. And I did find that, the conversations were able to go longer and people were able to go deeper and maybe more introspective than they might in a conventional talking head interview, though, I guess, to argue against myself, in which I find myself doing a lot. In the nightmare, we interviewed people. It's a movie about sleep paralysis, right? And people who experience this strange state of consciousness while they're hovering between being awake and being asleep. And we recorded those interviews. We filmed them, and we traveled to meet people, and we would record at night in their bedrooms. To try to be in the time and place where this kind of thing happened. We had pretty good luck, I think, that way too, in that experience too. I think if you're patient, and I mean, the one thing I find, when I'm interviewing people, and I imagine it's the same for you, is, the more time I can spend without saying a single word, allowing the other person to talk, the better I'm doing.
Especially if you have emoji reacts, so that you can get the like, I'm here with you, not saying anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to rewind a little bit on the nightmare, because there's something that I believe Jonathan Lethem says in A Glitch in the Matrix, which is that we all have this experience of kind of jolting awake from dreams and kind of sort of coming to from this other reality. And whatever that experience was, it's this like core human experience, which leads me now to wonder, based on what you're saying, was the impulse to create this movie, A Glitch in the Matrix, born of some of the work that you were doing in the nightmare, or was it kind of something more accidental or sort of incidental?
No, it absolutely came out of the nightmare in a way that's actually very direct. I can look backwards and feel like it seems like a very natural progression, because the other films are about people wrestling with mysteries and the sort of thin wall between fact and fiction, in particular genre fiction. But I mean, there's actually a person I was speaking to, who had experienced a lot of sleep paralysis and had seen a lot of those, sort of shadowy ghost figures, those shadow men, while he was in there. And he asked me point blank, "Do you know what simulation theory is?" And I didn't at the time. This would have been, I guess, like 2014. And he gave me the short version of it, and then explained that what he thought those shadow men were, the engineers of the simulation, the people checking in on the experiment. And, that put me into, the multi-year rabbit hole that eventually became Glitch in the Matrix.
And what was the research process like? Like, before you started conducting interviews with people, obviously you have Nick Bostrom in the film, so that makes a ton of sense. What other type of research were you doing to kind of get prepared to be able to, you know, conduct interviews in a way that would yield the type of like rich narrative content that ended up in the film?
Yeah, it's funny because I think maybe a lot of the research doesn't actually get into the film. It just goes to making you feel more confident to step into the world. Because for me, what was most important and most interesting were the firsthand experiences, of people, who believed in it or had really strong personal ideas about the possibility. And for that, I don't really need to know much other than to be able to ask them, well, where were you in your life when you started to think about this, and when you break it out, how does that work? But getting to that stage, it's funny. The research probably went across at least 3 tracks. I read as much of the science as I could get my head around, which is not a ton. At a certain at a very early stage, talking about quantum mechanics or Planck's constant or the holographic universe is pushing up against the limits of my bachelor's degree in arts as far as understanding the hard science. But I was able to get my head around some of the loose concepts. It was also, since I knew that Philip K. Dick figured really largely in the story of simulation theory entering our culture, as an idea, even if a fictional one. I read about a dozen of his books and watched every movie adaptation, including some of the lesser known ones like Screamers or Paycheck. Screamers is an interesting one. Paycheck maybe less so. And then I would pour into like Eric Davis, who appears in the book, and I think you might have been confusing him with Jonathan Lethem because they worked together on Philip K. Dick's exegesis. But Eric Davis is a really interesting guy who wrote a book called Technosis, and he's sort of the kind of guy who can go deep on sort of the surprisingly thin line between science and magic, technology and metaphysics, which is a place where that book goes. And when he was introduced to me actually by my friend Tim Kirk, who produced Room 237 and has been a collaborator forever, and he knew Eric somehow. I forget what his connection was. And when I realized that he was one of the editors of Philip K. Dick's exegesis, which was between writing like 10 books a year for a decade, in his spare time, he wrote 8,000 pages trying to understand this sort of gigantic quasi-religious like epiphany that hit him one day after dental surgery. And after it, he found himself struggling to understand ideas about man and the universe, and he tripped over. And what was especially interesting to me, especially because of sort of the nature of these films, talking about fact bleeding into fiction and vice versa, is that at a certain point he started to think that, or started to remember that his fiction was inspired by the reality of how things are. And if you look at his stuff, like he has a book, I'm At a Joint, from 1959, which is about a simulated world. It's not a digitally simulated world. It's more like a Truman Show kind of a large, in physically. And in that book, it was a 1959 city, for like at 1-to-1 scale, filled with actors, much like the Truman Show, is built, while the outside world was, his idea of a futuristic, I think it was 1990s. So between, watching all the, simulated world fiction, especially from the 90s, but going back and forth a little bit too, boning up on Philip K. Dick, some science, some mysticism, as well as deep into kind of like the glitch in the matrix Reddit thread and stories of people who have seen evidence, tried to collect evidence and just discuss it and share it, looking for glitches, right? Like the Mandela effect was also a big milestone in this, and in a really interesting way, Philip K. Dick talked about he didn't, he didn't have the word Mandela effect, but he talked about people changing the past and only some of us recognizing how things used to be. He had an example of like a light switch that had moved from one wall to another, or changed from a light switch to a chain hanging down. Um, and finding those kind of connections, was another, felt to me like a really important clue that I was on the right track when I was like, wow, Philip K. Dick predicted Mandela effects back in 1974. That's important. That means something.
Well, and that's a really striking moment. This is, as I said, I'm going to try to avoid any spoilers for anybody in the audience, although, in some sense, that's less of a concern in a movie of this nature. But there's this moment where Philip K. Dick is describing what you're describing to a room full of people accepting an award, and frames it not as these are, these are just sort of things I've imagined, but these are actually other worlds I've experienced. When you saw that, how, or did you know going into that video that that's what he was going to reveal? Like what, because that moment was so profound for me. And I feel like I was pretty well familiar with Philip K. Dick, and I'd never heard of that moment before.
Yeah, well, I mean, that comes from a speech that he made in Metz, France in 1977, oddly, the night after he saw Star Wars for the first time. And that speech is included in a book of his philosophical writings, and it's part of him trying to understand that experience. And he called that experience 2374 because it happened in March and April of 1974. And because weird coincidences and synchronicities have a way of popping up around these projects, I couldn't help but notice the eerie similarity between 237, the number of the hotel room in The Shining, and 2374, the event that changed Philip K. Dick's life. And that speech was a little hard to track down all over the internet. It was easy on YouTube to find this one excerpt where he says, "I believe we're living in a digitally created reality," and the clue, and you can only find, and the only clues of it are when things have changed, but it took some work to find the full speech, which was, ultimately, came from this French science educational company that, I guess, filmed the speech back in the day. And a guy did earlier Philip K. Dick's documentary, had a copy of the entire thing. And then listening to the whole thing, there was one conception of this movie was, well, let's just take the speech and, do a sort of illuminated version of it, use graphics and archival footage and cutaways and reenactments to help visualize it, because listening to it raw is pretty challenging, but there are amazing ideas within it, especially if you break it up a little bit so you can follow them. And there was stuff that didn't make it in either, like there's a long time part of it where he's talking about the impeachment of Nixon, and I was listening to it during the impeachment of our former president. So it really felt like time was collapsing in a strange way.
Mm. You got me thinking when you said 2374. Is A Glitch in the Matrix your fourth feature? Is Wikipedia steering me correctly in asking you that?
Well, it depends how you kind of qualify it, right? That it is my third. It's the third feature that I directed on my own. Between The Nightmare and Glitch, I co-directed a film called the El Duce tapes about this incredibly offensive, punk rock metal guy, El Duce, who a friend of Tim's had shot, like 80 hours of footage of him back in like 1992, and the footage had been sitting in a vault. And me and this and another filmmaker, David Lawrence, went through it and found a really interesting story buried in those VHS tapes. So that's a co-directing movie based on someone else's footage, and I've done different shorts or a piece of this movie. So third or fourth, depending how you count.
Yeah, I was just trying to reach for that like synchronicity thing of like all the numbers rack up. But speaking of sort of your oeuvre, one thing that really strikes me is that particularly Room 237 sort of is like so clearly like in the horror genre. And so, and you know, we're sort of in these like horror genre sort of coded festivals. And I'm just wondering, do you think of A Glitch in the Matrix as a horror film or having elements of horror? What's your relationship to to horror in a film like this that's veering into these other
Yeah,
territories?
well, it was originally conceived to be, if 237 and the Nightmare are sort of horror slash, documentaries. In a way, this was going to be my science fiction slash documentary, but certainly there are eerie, troubling, horror vibes from in different moments. I mean, some of it, I think there's just sort of like the existential horror of, the world collapsing around you. Then towards the end when we get into this one particular story, it's kind of a true crime story. It's got a very, I think it's got a very troubling, disturbing, kind of tone. Whether it's straight up horror, it's kind of a, semantic question. And I think it's got kind of a horror vibe, especially, even, when I watch it, I feel a little uneasy at the moments where, the camera is sort of pushing through the hallway and going down that staircase into the darkness. That feels like horror to me.
Yeah, I was seeing that scene when you were talking about that. Do you think the premise that we live in a simulation is like, where do you fall on that? I'm not asking you yet, at least, if we are. But either way, leave aside if you think we are. If we were, would you see that as an overall positive thing or an overall negative thing? Because so much of the sci-fi frames it as a negative thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's easy for me to argue either way. I think if you want to think about it as a negative, there's the notion of, well, nothing matters, right? And that's, clearly horrific. Or an interesting question, that kind of came to me while we were working on it is a lot of the people in the movie, start comparing things to video games, right? In a lot of violent video games, like there's some, fair amount of like GTA footage in it. And, on the one hand, if everybody lived like we were in a game of GTA, that would be pretty horrific. But it's hard to blame the people who are playing GTA for indulging in mayhem, because that's what that world is created for. That's the way that's the, all the incentives within the game are guiding you that direction, which I think asks an interesting question of, well, what are the incentives in this world guiding us to do? So it's all about, well, if it's a simulation, what's the purpose of the simulation? After the cut was fairly locked, but we were still kind of fine-tuning a lot of things, is when the first wave of COVID hit and the lockdown began. And I was really struck looking at this. There was sort of an interactive flash graphic, I think it was on the Washington Post, talking about infection rates, right? And they showed, it was a simple square. You had these blue dots that were floating through, and like one of them was red, and every time it touched another dot, that dot would turn red. You could change the variables here or there to make the infection spread quicker or have it spread slower. And I was looking at that diagram, and thinking that could be a simple version of this world, right? And it is, terrifying, to think, well, if this is a science experiment to see, if there is a infectious disease out there someplace, and then they make 100 worlds and change the variables in each one to see, how what strategies are going to help stop it. That doesn't suggest that the people out there are going to help you, right? In that if you get sick, that's part of the game. That's part of your purpose here. But similarly, there's a section in the movie, where Paul Goody, and it really struck me as one of the more positive ways to look at this thing. He compares idea of a simulated world to the idea of GANs, generative adversarial networks, which is the idea that you might set up competing AIs in order to solve a problem. And if the problem is to make a photograph, is one of the examples he used, that looks really realistic, you'll have program A try to create a realistic looking program, a photograph. Program B will look for flaws and attack them, which will inspire the first one to get better and better. And when I heard him talk that way, it led me, it led me to think, well, in a way, that's a very optimistic version of this idea, because it suggests that everyone's blood, sweat, and tears are happening for a purpose. Maybe it's a high-tech way of, answering the question, why do bad things happen to good people?
Do you think it also kind of gets at, like there's this thread of mysticism that accompanies the simulation question, no matter when and how it's brought up? Do you think that people are initially sort of struck by that question because it addresses some of the same maybe existential questions around purpose that, more like properly spiritual discussions normally lead to?
That was a surprise for me. I didn't necessarily go into it thinking that these conversations are going to lead to religious questions or religious metaphors and parallels. But every single person I talked to about it, after 10 or 15 minutes, began bringing up the religious parallels. And lots of people who, saw early cuts of the film had the same reaction that you did of, this is... In fact, I've heard it articulated really specifically that, wow, maybe simulation theory is, a religion for people who don't like old-fashioned religions. Of course, I think that gets to another, big fork in the road that I find when talking about simulation theory, that, there's there's at least two, but two in particular ways that I can think of talking about it. And one is, as a nuts and bolts reality, right? Where you're going to get into, trying to find the smallest pixel size through a microscope or an electronic telescope, and look for glitches in our reality in order to prove that we are actually living in a simulation in a highly sophisticated computer out there someplace. And that's one way of talking about it. And the other is talking about it as a metaphor. And when you use it as a metaphor, it gives you all sorts of language to use, when talking about people's, roles on Earth, their relationships to one another, or a relationship to a creator. Not to say that it couldn't be both or neither, but in a certain way, I find those to be kind of two separate questions.
I love that idea because it almost allows, especially since there's so much, as you said, like reference to games and the sort of like worlds that games create having implicit purpose. It almost allows somebody who moves in that direction, who's looking for clarity around their purpose, to almost like create a persona character to participate in a world that maybe they feel is otherwise devoid of any specific meaning.
That's interesting, and I don't think we spent that much time talking about people like really getting into their avatars, but that's a really, there's a lot there to poke at, right? Especially when you think of, how, getting fit and getting in style, that in trying to groom your avatar into something appropriate for the role that you want to play, in this world. And I took special interest in designing this avatar, this world, which doesn't look much like me, but it was really fun to, try to start with a blank slate and say, well, what do I want to look like? What do I want to look like? And what do I want to look like for this purpose, for this activity? Like if this was a combat game, I probably would have created a very different, avatar. But, this was for a social world.
Speaking of which, all of the guests and those of you in the crowd, if you haven't seen the documentary yet, by the way, it's on Hulu and video on demand, so you have no excuse not to see it if you haven't yet. but all the guests in the documentary, or not all the guests, I shouldn't say, a number of the guests in the documentary are embodied as avatars. I'd love to unpack the sort of creative process behind that decision.
Yeah, well, it was one of the early ideas, right? Because each of these films, I probably overthink what the sort of creative attack is. Because for better or for worse, whether it makes the movies cool or maybe a little precious, I work hard to try to find a style that is going to reflect the subject of the film. And clearly, this one wanted to be very digital. And very early on, thinking about, well, what do the interviews want to look like if we see the people, and the idea of avatars came very quickly, especially since I wasn't doing much in VR really back then, but even just in chatting with people on my phone, I'd use a little thumbnail picture, and sometimes it was a photo of me, or sometimes it was a card, sometimes it was Mechanicong from King Kong Escapes, or sometimes it was an obscure comic book character. I liked Mr. Mind, the evil intelligent worm from Shazam, and I would switch through finding different kind of characters that I liked, but they I liked them as representatives of me. So the idea of avatars felt like a fun way to play where this kind of communication was going to go in the future. And technically, it was also a really kind of fun process where I would do regular Skype interviews, with folks, and then have everybody step away so that we get a clean shot, of whatever their space was. And as much as a micromanager I can be, I made it really clear to myself that I was not going to ask them to reframe the camera to try to find a more interesting corner of their house, or to light it in any particular way. I wanted to embrace the randomness of wherever they happened to be talking from. And then we engaged this comic book artist, Chris Burnham, who's worked on, he did Batman Incorporated with Grant Morrison, and has a new one called Die, Die, Die with guy from The Walking Dead, and he's got an amazing, expressive way of drawing, and actually has created a lot of really amazing looking characters. So he watched an early cut of the movie, and we talked about what kind of fictional characters could be sort of appropriate for these folks, and he did different versions and created these illustrations from which the 3D team made models. And really just in in 2019, as we were working on it, this sort of motion capture suit became available at the at the level that an indie doc would be able to afford to do it, right? That there's no way we're going to be able to use the technology in the rooms of a Lord of the Rings Gollum kind of thing, but that product has actually made it to the consumer level, and there's probably even newer, better, cheaper versions of it now. And the animator would watch the folks and kind of mimic their gestures a little bit and express it with his own kind of flair, and then those characters would be moved back into the scenes. And nice thing that gave us was we were able to use those same characters in the reenactments and the dramatic scenes in the digital worlds, in which they looked all the more appropriate, right? So that also gave us a funny idea that I liked, maybe a notion that we're talking to video game characters on their day off when they go back home and they leave the video game world.
And speaking of which, I know that we were maybe going to be lucky enough to have one of the guests in the crowd. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Paul is here. He was the lion, if you guys remember, sort of the Masters of the Universe philosopher king. Here he is, up on the balcony.
Hello.
Yes. So, Paul, if you could put your hand raise emoji up, what I can do is allow you to speak from there. So just give me 1 second to set that up. So if you go ahead and put your hand raise emoji, or click the raise hand button that just emerged down on the bottom right.
Okay, I think I did it.
All right, you should be live. Go ahead and try it out.
Okay, what, do I just talk like that?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello, everyone.
How's it going?
This is very odd. It's great. I feel like I chose a great spot to address people.
Just like the Pope.
Hey, it's me, the Pope. Hello. The Pope is always Italian, no matter where he's from.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a subject in this documentary?
Yeah, I've said this before. This is sort of one of my first stock answers is everyone who sees the movie misses the treat that the eyewitnesses in the movie had, which is having a conversation with Rodney. You now have had a conversation with Rodney, so you know it's very enjoyable. It's one of the best things about working with him. It's just I would look forward to every time that he would call me. I knew that we would have a good conversation and it'd be fun. And that's, I mean, for me anyway, that's really kind of the best thing was I had already seen Room 237. I'd seen The Nightmare. I was a big fan of his work, so the chance to work with him on something that I was really passionate about was crazy and awesome.
That's awesome. And can you tell us a little bit about who your avatar was in this documentary?
Yeah, my avatar in this, I was, and you know, had I thought of it, I would have tried to recreate it here. I didn't really even, but he was sort of a lion-looking, as Rodney put it, exiled philosopher king. So, and I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to you, Rodney, but when I first saw it, I thought it was Hanuman, because the lion is very monkey-looking.
Oh, that's
because he's a
interesting.
humanoid. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it was really cool. I have just a minor anecdote that I met the guy who did the motion capture of me in a situation kind of like this, where we were both avatars talking about him being my avatar in the film. So that was kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, I remember, at Sundance had a VR event kind of like this, because the festival was, closed to physical showings and parties that year. And the craziest thing was I was speaking to this one critic in something very much like the way we're talking, and I was asking about the avatars and said, well, why did you use those avatars in the movie? And I'm just like, look around at where we are. I mean, this is the world that we're moving into.
Totally.
Yeah, and I just have to say, Sundance's avatars had nothing on the ones here. These are 10 times better.
Technology moves fast, right?
Indeed. And Altspace has done a great job. I do want to take this moment to thank Jess and thank everybody at Altspace, in addition to everybody at NIGHTSTREAM and all the festivals, for putting on this sort of awesome event and creating this space. So let's give them a round of applause real quick. And also a follow-up round of applause for Paul for not only being here, but picking the absolutely perfect spot to be able to addressing us about all things simulation. So I can keep going with questions. As those of you who know me, I can just kind of constantly throw new questions out. I do want to leave some time for Q&A. So I've already now enabled hand raising, and so as if you go down on your bottom right, there's a little hand raise emoji. I'll be able to see you come up and do what I just did with Paul and put you on the megaphone so that everybody can hear you from wherever you're standing. You don't have to come all the way up. So I'll give you time to do that and ask the one question that I definitely wanted to make sure I ask, which is probably not what you're expecting, which is, what is the conversation about simulation and about the idea of living in a simulation that people either never ask or seem to always get wrong from your perspective?
The one that hardly ever comes up that I find really interesting is assuming that the simulation is something that's going to be created in the future, right? And even if the simulation has already happened, we're reliving the walk up to it. But that being the case, what major milestones do you see happening around us, towards building that simulation, right? And for me, one of the big ones is Google Earth. And one thing I love about it, and we used a lot of it within the movie, and as I kind of obsessed on it, I thought that kind of occurred to me was, there's this short story. I think it might be Borgia or Italo Calvino. I think it's Borgia, called is it on precision in science, perhaps? In any case, there's a story of a king who is like really map crazy, and on exactitude in science, it's called. And there's a king who's map crazy, and no map that his map makers make is ever good enough until he insists that they build one at 1-to-1 scale and plop it down on top of the real world. And then it's told about, people, explorers who come hundreds of years later will pick up a rock and find a picture of the rock underneath it at 1-to-1 scale, that little fragments of it would be left. And as I think about Google Earth, it is a 1-to-1 recreation of the world, and one that we can see. It isn't made out of canvas or cloth. You need a phone or a digital device in order to see it. But like that short story, it's a 1-to-1 recreation of the world, overlaid on top of the real one. And I imagine something kind of like, there's that railroad. There's this sort of like when the East Railroad and the West Railroad met in the middle, and somebody drove that spike. That between Google Earth and maybe a digital version of New York that they make for video games or even for science fiction movies, that like there'll be a grand kind of convergence of all the different of all these different reproductions of the world and all of our Facebook profiles, and sort of creating simulation version 1.0, and sort of watching those milestones come into existence is both kind of exciting and kind of scary, a little bit like discovering the prototypes of the Terminator at Skynet and T2.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there anything when we think about that roadmap? Are there any signs or indicators that you're keeping your eye on? Like, oh, once we're capable of this, or once this development comes along, that'll be a big moment.
I think when we could do this in Google Earth, right, and we can say we can meet at a replication of a real location like that, and it's the same one that everybody is sharing and accessing. So if we say, hey, everybody, let's go to my childhood home, that everybody would be, we would all be there at once. I think that would be a very big step.
Mm. Yeah, it's like a
we actually tried to
Google
do animation. Yeah, we tried to do some animation in Google Earth to like put 3-dimensional objects and stuff into it, and we were not quite able to pull that off at the level we were hoping. We could, move cameras through it.
Were you in Google Earth VR or Google Earth Desktop when you were doing that?
We used both, right? One of the guy who did most of the avatar animation, Lorenzo Bonda, he did most of his animation within VR just because he liked the way he could access the toolkit. He did some of it within Google Earth VR.
Very cool. All right. I think we might have a shy audience, or I'm not doing something right. So I'm gonna try this.
We've got one over down there.
Boom. There we go. All right. Synesthesia. I think you probably end in synesthesia, but it ends in an I for me. You are live.
Yeah. I guess I have a comment and a couple questions. So it seems like, in the beginning, natural philosophers and then later scientists, maybe even alchemists to some degree, looked at the natural world, and then they used that as a reference to create technology. And now we've reached this point where we have so much technology that it seems like sometimes we look at technology in order to make explanations for the natural world. And in reference to simulation theory, I wonder if you had any comments on that, and if you don't, that's fine. And then also, this idea of fiction and then fact, and the influence of fiction upon fact. Do you think that sometimes the creations of artists, whether it be literary or in the world of cinematics, I suppose that's been going on for 120 years, maybe something like that. Do you think that those, and especially when they interact to a large degree with the human populace, that somehow those thoughts actually manifest?
So I'm not sure if say that again.
Did you guys hear any of that?
It was
yeah,
it was real
very faint,
quiet,
but now we hear you
but
great.
now you're set. Now you're loud and clear.
Should I repeat myself? Did you
That would be
catch any of
amazing
that?
if you could.
Okay.
No, there were two very
So-
different questions. If we wanted them one at a time.
Yeah, let's start with
Yeah,
one,
and then
we'll do the other.
also, yes, the whole fact fiction thing, and what do you think about it? And then also, everyone talks about, Dark City and the Matrix and stuff, but
Sure.
I don't hear hardly any people talking about the 13th floor, which I thought was pretty decent.
Yeah, well, the 13th floor is one thing I like about it, and alongside of probably my favorite simulation movie, Existenz, is that there are three
Oh, yeah,
world
yeah,
movies, right? That there's a level above and a level below. Matrix is only a two-world movie, and the 13th floor, which in some ways feels like it's falling between the cracks, does have that one image of the guy on the side of the road with the highway that turns into kind of a green wireframe, which
Mhm.
I think has got enough iconic power that most everybody remembers it. And we used that shot in the film. The other interesting thing about it, and
Yeah,
I'm a
sorry,
fan
I
of that
see,
film.
the film.
Okay. Another interesting thing about it is it's based on the same book as there's a German film from the 70s
Yes.
called World on a Wire, based on the same book. I think it's called Simulacron 3. It's
I
a
did not know that.
it's there's a Criterion version of it because it's like 3 or 4 hours long. It was like a two-part miniseries. It's Fastbinder, and like 13th Floor, it's a great kind of blend of almost like detective noir and in science fiction. World on a Wire in particular is real. One of the great things about World on a Wire that I've never seen an idea that's never I haven't seen in other science fiction movies is that the simulated world has an ambassador. That there's one guy there who knows that their world is fake, and he's there to like sort of when the people from above, when the creators come down, he's there to meet them and and show them around, which is a great conceit for a character.
So Stesiak, did you want to ask the other question that we hadn't been able to hear?
I think he maybe heard some of it. So to sum up very quickly,
Quiet again.
sorry, I muted. Oh, can you hear
There
me
was
now?
something about like the natural world and in simulated worlds.
So for a very long time, natural philosophers and scientists, some degree alchemists, looked at the natural world and created technology from it. Now we look to technology for explanations for the natural world. I think simulation theory falls somewhat in that vein. Whether right or wrong, I'm not making any judgments either way. I was just wondering if you had any comments on that sort of perspective, and then also fiction. Does it aid in the development of our factual future?
Well, as far as to your first question, I can say there was one sort of hypothetical character I had hoped to find. Right? Like sometimes when I do these, I kind of imagine a person who would be the perfect kind of character for one of these movies, and we were not able to find this one. But I had read that in the development of some of video games, in particular ones that work at gigantic scales, that could be that elements of these worlds could be created procedurally, right? That wouldn't need a designer to design every animal, every plant, every cliff face, every body of water, but that you could find the right algorithm and the game could generate that stuff itself. And I remember somewhere I read an account of there was a game designer working on that, and they couldn't find a formula or an algorithm that where everything looked good until he read an article in Nature or like a zoology kind of magazine or something about plants grew, and they put that algorithm to the game, and everything took off, and it was like Project Genesis in Star Trek 2. And in my imagination, I was thinking of a character did something like that, and then would go on a hike right, and look at plants and trees and imagine that the same algorithm that he used in the game is helping the trees, break into branches, and the branches into leaves, and the leaves into stems. But that was like that hypothetical game designer who had that epiphany, I think might have been a character that I invented and not one in the real world that we were ever able to find. And as far as like there's a section where Eric Davis talks specifically about do science fiction ideas inspire real world inventions, and sometimes that happens. And like in 2001, there's really interesting kind of moment on the side where one of the astronauts in the Discovery looks like he's reading the newspaper on an iPad. And clearly there's something to the fact that people want that before you can invent something, you need to be able to think of something, right? So science fiction movie will visualize it. It will give you a target to aim at. But sort of the bigger philosophical question of like fiction becoming true. Again, there was a really interesting example in the movie. Philip K. Dick talked about one of his characters, met a woman who told him that his books were true, and then the same thing happened to him where he met a woman that told him his books were true, and then Chris Ware, the cartoonist, is in the film, and he talks about the same thing happening, where he wrote a story about a character who, in middle age, meets his long lost father, and then the father shortly died. And as he was working on that story, Chris, who had never met his dad, meets his dad in late middle age, and then the father died. Wow. His friends would tease him about, could you please write a story in which, I find $1 million. It seems like your stories are coming true. And even in the exegesis, which is even though they cut it from 8,000 pages to 800, and there's still challenges that are impenetrable, and I only made it about 150 in. But there was a section where he talked about his friends complaining to him that his sci-fi dystopian ideas were coming true, and maybe he should knock it off.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you, Synesthesiac. Going to Carlos. You are live.
Hello. Mic check.
You're sounding great.
All right, Rodney, first of all, I love the way you dressed up your avatar. You did a great job. It looks like you put some thought
Thanks,
into that.
man.
And thank you for sharing this with Jesse. I appreciate you guys stopping by and doing educating us. There are two questions. One is, what was it like for you in the younger years when you were in your teens or in your 20s, when your life started to explore the thoughts that have brought you to this point? And the second question is, what is the next big project that is just going to blow everybody away?
Well, I'll start with the second one because it's less interesting, because I don't have anything to announce. That I've got a half dozen things I'm researching, and we'll see which which fictional idea becomes reality first. As for the other, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, as a teenager, I was a shy Jewish kid going to a Catholic school because that was like the only decent school in our neighborhood. Which didn't make me a gigantic outcast or anything, but did give me a little bit of a remove from from the waters I was swimming in. And I was deep into science fiction and comics and video games. And I mean, originally I wanted to be a comic book artist, because the idea of always wanting to make things and tell stories and to create kind of wild imagery, outrageous tableaus. But strangely, I soured on that path, because I found out pretty quickly that I probably wasn't a good enough, illustrator, to be a comic book artist, but also that life was mostly sitting alone in a room, drawing pictures. And I saw imagery of filmmakers, which seemed much more social, much more adventurous. which really appealed to me. But of course, a lot of the filmmaking that I've done has wound up being me alone in a room in front of a computer. So the joke is kind of on me.
What city was it that you were in when you were growing up and going to that Catholic school?
All right. Any other questions from the audience? This is your chance. Your burning simulation questions. While we wait to see if anybody overcomes shyness, what are your thoughts on if we're in a simulation?
Well, I've got no idea, right? And I'm perfectly happy not knowing. But for me, the one thing I would say is, if it is a simulation, then I don't think simulation is the right word, right? Like if we talk about, that flash animation in the Washington Post where we see the blue dots turn red, that from our point of view, the creators, the audience of that simulation, it's a simulation, right? And because among other things, that little thing doesn't have all the qualities of our world. But from the point of view of little blue dots, it's not a simulation of anything, it's their world, right? And even if the world above has elements and abilities and qualities that not only we can't we experience, but we can't imagine, then that doesn't make this experience less real for us. This is still our real world. And until the invents of the red pill, which I don't know whether or not it could possibly exist. One thing I think of is, those posters where if you it looks like white noise or paisley, but if you cross your eyes, you can see like a 3D dragon or cast kind of coming out of it. That even if that is sort of the reality of our world, right? And there's some science about the idea that this world might be two-dimensional information that we process as 3D because it's easier to live in it. And like this one that we're in right now is a great example of that. That I'm sensing a three-dimensional world that I can operate and move through, even though that's not what it really what it really is. But through these two lenses and these controls, I can navigate it. That turning and I think Paul, you might have talked about that too, that breaking this down into what the reality of it is, uncrossing our eyes so we don't see the dragon and we only see the noise isn't going to make this world easier to cope with or navigate.
Yeah, it could actually be very disorienting. And after you do it, you're like, oh no, I broke it. And
I broke it.
Feel horrible. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
Well,
that made a big impression on me.
I'm reminded of that scene in The Matrix where he's holding the piece of steak on his fork, saying like, "I know this isn't." I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but like, "I know this isn't real, but I prefer it."
Yeah, no, I get it.
All right, and with that, we are going to call this episode. Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to Rodney for being here. Rodney, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you guys. This was a blast.
All right, so for everyone else, remember there is another solid week of NIGHTSTREAM programming. And Rodney, could you tell everybody it's Hulu, video on demand, anywhere else where they can find A Glitch in the Matrix?
There is a Blu-ray, and the nice thing about the Blu-ray is we've got the entire. There's a couple of clips from this sort of 10-minute educational animated film from the 70s in which Orson Welles retells the tale of Plato's Cave, and we were able to get a print of the film from the Museum of Moving Image in Melbourne, Australia, and run a high-definition transfer of it. We've got that entire film on the Blu-ray.
Amazing.
So shout out to Orson Welles.
For so many things.
Yes. Legend.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Feel free to stick around and go to other worlds, but also make sure to go do awesome NIGHTSTREAM stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And
That
then-
was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Hey, Paul.
Here we go.
Hey, there you are. Oh wait, hold on. I'm still Still broadcasting to everybody. Sorry, everybody. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah. Wow,
Hey.
you were able to make an avatar that kind of looks like you.
All right. Well, I'm
Can't
heading
hear
out,
ya.
man, but this is fun.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I'll see you
One
soon.
second. How about now?
And let me know next time you're in LA.
Better.
I know. I need to give
does
more
that
of a
work?
heads up next time. I was
Yeah.
like, well, I'm here to like.
So yeah,
everyone,
that's
and
why
then
I think if
left.
there is a level above this
But
one,
I'll
I
try not
probably
to show
look
up in a cloud
something
of
like
smoke
this.
time.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and we have a
Yeah.
little patio, so it'll be a respite
So
rather than
yeah, it took me
an added,
literally until like
added
5
stressor.
minutes before this started
Amazing. That sounds
to
great.
navigate all the
Good, I'll see you
different
soon.
oops.
See it.
Yeah,
What-
it's I set it up a little while back, but this is a lot more chill than Rec Room.
Oh yeah, much better.
Thank you so
Hello.
much, Rodney. Hey, nice to
Yeah,
meet
sure.
you. I'm Jess.
Hey, nice to meet you.
He
I'm
helped
sorry,
put
say
us
again?
together.
Oh, I'm Jess. In world, I'm Poseidon.
Hi,
though,
Jess.
so you can call me Poseidon as well.
Oh, okay, yeah, you and I are friends now.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much.
Yeah.
I was
All right,
just
Taking a
telling
selfie.
Rodney.
Yes, please.
It took me.
Oh yeah, let's actually all take a selfie.
Oh yeah.
Let's see here. I almost got us all. Okay, let me try one more time.
Buzz.
Nope, didn't work.
I took a picture of Carlos.
All right,
Did
well, I've
the,
got one with each. I got one with each of you.
All right, if you got it, then we're good. All right, appreciate you guys. I have to hop to a dinner.
Thanks for setting
but,
that up, Jesse. That was cool.
Yeah, I'll see you guys soon.
All right.
All right.
Hey, see ya.
Good to see
So
you,
yeah,
Paul.
speaking of, yeah, I'm gonna have to feed the dog now.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get back to the real world.
Yeah, nice to see you. You know,
Great
here.
to see you. Here,
Yeah.
right? But it feels.
Yeah,
I mean, this one feels realer than most.
it's so much
It's-
better than all the other ones. Yeah, 10 out of 10.
Yeah, it's nuts. And like this kind of event
I
you
can
can do,
guess.
and it feels like a live event. It's really interesting. I wonder
Yeah,
if they
it
must be
really-
doing concerts and must be doing concerts and stuff too.
I know one of the big things is that Reggie Watts did a thing here.
I believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's always on the cutting edge. I don't know if I ever told you, but when I was living in Seattle, and my friend Ben and I were doing audio performance art stuff, he would sometimes come in because he used to live in Seattle and do something right before us. And it was always like, okay, well, that's it. Nothing
Reggie Watts
I
would do
do
it
is
right
going to
before
match. Yeah.
you.
So anyway, Rodney, as always, a pleasure. Thanks for letting me know about it, and I'll talk to you more later.
Sure. Thanks for being a special guest star.
Pow. Yep. See ya.
Rodney,
See ya.
Rodney, before you leave,
Yeah.
I'm going to find you on Twitter, and then I'll send you a link. I shot the whole video from beginning to end as a single
Oh,
camera,
cool.
and it'll be on
Wow.
YouTube on my channel. So if it'll be unlisted, but you can share it if you wish to, or go back and listen to it for whatever reason, or you want to share it with your family or friends or whatever it may be.
Thanks. I appreciate that. You're Carlos, right?
That's right. And I happen to be in Austin, where I think you won an award with fantastic filmmakers here back
Yeah,
in
Tech Fest. Yeah, a while back.
2012 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, were you there then?
No, I didn't. I just did some research on you before I came to this, just to get a little
okay.
more familiar with your life and the work your body of work. And so congratulations on your achievements. And is your dear mom still alive?
Oh yeah, she's still around.
All right, well, give her my best. My mom's
Okay.
gone, and it's always.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, it is what it is. You know, we all come
Yeah.
to those sunset years, but have a wonderful life and be a good person.
You too, sir. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye bye.
All right.
Hey, John. Is the cat inside? Oh, there he is. I see him. Did that take some of the rattle out? The rattle from the floor. Thanks for the offer, John. Period. Thanks for the offer, John. Period. Do you have a website that I can go check out? Question mark. I want to draw a grid. Yeah, so I want to basically try and measure it, use the grid, because always using the grid on it's not so really neat to experience shots. I can look again and see if I can find it.